Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. Now, I don't normally love a quote. My social media pages are not littered with positive thinking memes, and I can generally never remember anything like that, which makes me wonder if they're any use at all, if they're forgettable. However, a few things do stick in my mind, and the title of today's episode, I Can See a Church by Daylight, is one of them. This is a line from Much Ado About Nothing by William Shakespeare. And as much as I'd love to give the impression that I'm often to be found reading the Bard at any given moment of the day, it's more a case of it hanging around in my unconscious since I studied at A-level many years ago. It's a line said by Beatrice to her uncle when he gives her a backhanded compliment about her acute perception of the world. She comes back with, "I can see a church by daylight." So what she's saying is, she can see something that's right in front of her. This line has got me thinking, do we actually see things that are right in front of us? I don't know that we do. In the worlds of psychodynamic and coaching, the practitioner is often the one who holds up the mirror to the client about what might be in front of their faces that they're avoiding. So why might we not be seeing a church by daylight? You'll be pleased to learn that it's time to get out our defence mechanism bingo cards once again. For a quick reminder for everyone, our defence mechanisms are the things that our unconscious provides for us to keep us safe when we're feeling a little bit of anxiety. They're absolutely normal, really common, and not necessarily something that we should be dismantling automatically. So let's see what we've got today. We've got repression. Now, repression is where we squish things down into our unconscious that we don't want to see. We don't want these difficult thoughts dancing around our conscious mind, so we squish them away, we put them into our unconscious. Now, things that go into our unconscious, a lot of things get repressed into our unconscious. So this includes things that are too anxiety-inducing. What I'm talking about here is those things that create too much of a panic for us. Our conscious minds really don't want us to feel anxiety. We will do absolutely anything we can to avoid feeling anxious. So there's a filtering in our psychic structure, which actually means that our minds squish down into our unconscious. It represses down the things that make us anxious, so it keeps us away. So if that church makes us anxious, if we're seeing it by daylight, in it goes to our unconscious. We also repress things when there's just too much information, particularly in today's world. There's so much out there, and there's only a tiny, tiny amount that can be held in our conscious mind at any one time. Freud talks about this. He said at any one time, there's only very little that's held in our conscious mind. Most of the action is going on in our unconscious. So the things that are too much for us, we don't need, we're just going to push down we're going to repress down into our unconscious. Now, sometimes the other things that get repressed into our unconscious are things that we don't understand. I'm pretty guilty of this when it comes to IT, as my brother will attest. If I'm explained some IT, some tech that I perhaps really ought to know, and I don't want to know, I'm going to repress this away. And then we'll quite genuinely say, when my brother says to me, "But I've explained this to you," I'll be like, no, you haven't. Because I've repressed it away. I don't want to see it because I don't want to have to deal with it. This links in very closely to our next defence mechanism, the defence mechanism of denial. This is incredibly common. And if you were to take your bingo card outside and to have a look in the outside world, you would see a lot of denial going on. Let's use the example of Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story. I'm sure many of us have seen this film. Buzz Lightyear is a toy in a child's bedroom, but he doesn't believe he's a toy. For him, he's absolutely convinced he's a space ranger, and he's landed on a distant planet. And even when Woody the cowboy says to him, "You are a toy," Buzz says back, "You are a strange little man, and you have my pity." He absolutely doesn't see this. So he's going to pretend it's not there. Now, we can deny things even if there's absolute concrete evidence in front of us that these things have happened. And we do this because it's just too much for our conscious mind to deal with. We can't cope with the outcome of what the reality might be. So we're going to pretend it's not there. So what might be going on with I Can See a Church by Daylight is it's there. The proof is that it's there. But our unconscious works really hard at keeping that out from our conscious mind. And so for us, consciously, we think the church isn't there. Our minds can work really hard at keeping things out of our conscious awareness that we don't want there. We've also got the defence mechanism of projection. So this is where we take something out of our psychic structures that we don't like about ourselves and we locate this into somebody else. So we're going to maybe take the fact that we get angry about something and we're going to put that in somebody else, and we decide that they're angry. I think I've used the example before of, let's say we work in a big company and we're not very happy in our job, but we don't want to acknowledge that we're not very happy in our job because realistically speaking, we'd then have to do something about it. And that could cause us huge amounts of problems. We might realise that we have to take time in looking for another job. We might have to start redoing our CV. We might have to start looking on internet search engines, all of which takes time. It also might indicate some failures that we perceive within ourselves, and we don't want to admit these to ourselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to locate them in somebody else. So giving the example that I used of somebody working in an organisation, they're not very happy. They could decide that Barry from accounts actually isn't very happy. They've split off their unhappiness and they've located it in Barry. Now Barry then might walk round thinking, this is odd. I have a strange feeling of unhappiness, but I don't know where that's coming from. And he might dismiss it, or he might identify with it. That could become, if he identifies with it, that becomes projective identification, but that's quite a complicated one, so I'm not going to go into that so much today. So projection is possibly, to use our church by daylight example, denying to ourselves that we see the church or that the church is there, but actually saying that Barry from accounts is seeing the church instead. We've then got undoing. I've not really talked about this defence mechanism so much so far. It's a really interesting one, particularly in today's culture, because it's linked very much to the idea of the cancel culture. And what we're talking about here is, if we don't like something, or we don't think that it agrees with our view of the world, then we can just deny that it exists. And this is a really powerful defence mechanism, as it can do a lot of damage, both externally and internally. So what I mean by this is, if you're cancelled because of something that you've done or you've said, or something that people have perceived that you've done or said, this can absolutely ruin your career and your reputation. I went to see Micky Flanagan at the O2 probably about a year ago now, and I was quite taken with the fact that we had to put our mobile phones in a lockable container. And when we got in there and he started doing his show, I absolutely understood why he did this, because if you'd recorded just a moment of it and then put it on the internet, there's every possibility that he'd have been cancelled for what he was saying, because it would have been taken out of context. And that would have been incredibly unfair, because also you go to see a Micky Flanagan show, you know what you're signing up for. So it would be unfair to cancel somebody on something that is part of who they are. So if you've bought into that, then why would you be destroying them? So that's it on an external point of view. On an internal point of view as well, there's an awful lot of damage that can be done to people personally. If you feel that you've been cancelled, it takes away part of who you are. We can cancel things in our mind too, and it doesn't really do anybody else any harm. An example that I'd share with you here is the latest James Bond film for me doesn't exist in my mind because I dislike the ending so much. For me, it took away everything that made James Bond, and I know that people have a lot of strong feelings about James Bond, but for me, if I think James Bond is out there saving the world, it gives me a sense of safety. Whether or not that's true, who knows? So for me, in my mind, I hated the ending so much, it wasn't true to a James Bond film. So for me, that film doesn't exist. But wishing doesn't make it so. I can decide that it isn't there in my world, but let's be honest, the reality is that it does exist, much as I'd rather that it didn't. So my invitation for you this week is for you to consider where in your life you might be avoiding seeing a church by daylight. And why might this be? What might you not want to see? Now, do give yourself some grace here. It's very common for us to feel this way and for us to almost have a move along the bus please, there's nothing to see here attitude to how we're feeling. And remember that we have defence mechanisms for a reason, to keep us from perceived harm and anxiety. And it might not be the ideal moment to start to dismantle these. As always, awareness is key. Considering why we might be avoiding seeing or feeling certain things can be the starting point to working out what's going on for us right now. Do you actually want to see the church by daylight? Or is it better for you to just be aware that it's there in your periphery? Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.